Boris Johnson is such a complicated and almost larger than life person. He is very difficult to sum up in a few words. I first met him on my first day at Oxford University. He was in his last year and I arrived. We had a mutual friend, so we all went for lunch on that first day. And he was already had a lively love life. He was engaged to a family friend of ours who I knew quite well, which is also where we had lunch. And he had a very, very strong personality from the beginning. And I'm of the belief that people don't really change personality when they enter office, when they become a leader, as he did last year. But with Boris, he's maybe outdone himself in recent months. You know, he took over the Conservative Party in a bit of a hostile way from Theresa May, the Prime Minister. He then split the party over Brexit, and he basically purged the party of all those Conservatives who were against Brexit or wanted a softer Brexit. So he fired a lot of cabinet ministers. He then won a landslide general election, the biggest election victory since Thatcher's second victory in the 1980s. And to remind everyone, the Conservative Party in Britain has been in power already for more than a decade. First David Cameron, then Theresa May, now Boris Johnson. So it's really a remarkable achievement, this landslide victory. He then pushed through Brexit in I think a rather hard way at the end of January. He, in the meantime, was negotiating, starting a love affair, getting a girlfriend pregnant, we now know earlier than they said, because when they announced on February 29th that he's getting divorced and getting remarried and his girlfriend is pregnant, they said they'll have a baby in the summer, but they had a baby today, it's still April. So Boris he only agreed divorce terms about 2 days before that announcement in February. He has 4 children that he rarely sees from his wife, who's not yet divorced from, and he has at least 1, possibly 2 or 3 other children as well as a whole number of other affairs. The reason I mention the affairs is not to cast judgment on his private life, he can do what he likes, but to show that he's kind of larger than life, some would say reckless, some would say rash. And I also later worked at the same time as him as a journalist at the Daily Telegraph. And indeed, I had a very nice lunch with him in Prague, of all places, when he was the Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. And I was covering Prague, this is in 1994, for the Daily Telegraph. We had a nice 2.5-hour lunch in Mustek, in the center of Prague. And Boris was a very successful journalist. He went on to edit The Spectator magazine. He was the lead columnist for the Daily Telegraph, but he was also a very controversial journalist. When he worked for the Times, Rupert Murdoch, the owner of the Times, sacked him. And Rupert Murdoch does not fire star columnists very easily. He fired him because Boris Johnson told a series of blatant lies to the editor. I won't go into details now, but only to say that he has a reputation, even among the rough and tumble world of British journalists, of not necessarily telling the truth. He also has a reputation in politics for lying, more than other politicians do. I'm not sure it's fair, but I think it's worth mentioning. And he has a style which is slightly, will kind of muddle through. He's very, very charming. Has a great sense of humor. He's very articulate. He gives great speeches and uses great phrases, which wins people over and probably why he won the election. But the question is that good for governing? So far, his first really only test has been the coronavirus crisis. And I think that so far he has failed it big time. First of all, the figures Britain gives, as you may know, are only for hospital deaths. And we now know that in Britain, maybe twice or even more than twice that number have died in old age people's homes, hostels and care homes. The Financial Times last week did a very thorough investigation and concluded, as of last week, that 44,000 people in Britain had died from the virus, as opposed to about 18,000, which was the figure for last week, the official figure, which is now about 21,000. If that's the case, and more than 40,000 people have died, that makes Britain easily the most fatalities in Europe. And per capita, at least among the OECD countries that we can trust, it's the worst death rate in the world. And even if the Financial Times has got it wrong, there is no doubt that thousands of people have died in health homes, because the health homes have been providing figures, and so has the Office for National Statistics. And it's not an accident that Britain has done quite badly, and it's not an accident that Boris Johnson himself contracted the virus and probably gave it to his pregnant girlfriend in a slightly reckless way. Boris Johnson decided not to attend the first 5 so-called COBRA meetings about the virus, starting in late January through to early March. There were 5 emergency British government meetings, and Boris Johnson decided not to go to any of them. And this is in keeping with his personality, in which he often doesn't turn up to things. And he is accused of allowing thousands of extra people to die by not preparing properly for the pandemic. Or rather, Britain had a very good plan for the pandemic that was formulated in 2016. And indeed, the Singapore government, when asked, why have you dealt with coronavirus so well, they said, we used the British plan that was formulated in 2016. The problem is that when he was warned in January that Britain didn't have enough basic masks, basic equipment, and so on, Britain did very little to replenish supplies, and indeed sent some of its supplies to China in late February. And then Britain, until this week, for example, Britain had no checks at Heathrow Airport. More than 180,000 people have flown in from Wuhan and other Chinese affected cities between late January and beginning of April. 180,000 people came without any checks at all as they arrived in Britain. Also from northern Italy, at a time when many other countries, including the Czech Republic, were severely limiting flights into Prague, Britain was having a lot of people arrive from all over the place without any checks at all. They just came in, nobody took temperatures, nobody suggested self-isolation. Also things like face coverings. Until today, it's not a recommendation to wear face coverings even in supermarkets or so on. So it is said that that it's not an accident, any of this. It's been mishandled throughout. One might say that originally they were going for this herd immunity idea and maybe deliberately trying to have people catch the virus. And then they abruptly changed their minds at some point in March when it was a bit late. And I don't want to be too unfair on Boris, because I would say it would be even worse had he lost the election in December and Jeremy Corbyn, who was then leader of the Labour Party, had come to power. And broadly speaking, I'm an admirer of Boris. He's certainly very, very intelligent, and he's very knowledgeable. But he does, like everybody, have character flaws, and these character flaws may have led him to fail badly on his first major test, this pandemic. He also failed because Britain has spent the last 2 years obsessing over Brexit. So one of the reasons the British supplies were run down is that all the planning was put into no-deal Brexit preparations in the last year or two. So Britain alone, among, compared to Germany or even compared to France, has had much less equipment, which is why more than 100 doctors and nurses have died of coronavirus. They haven't had basic face coverings often in hospitals and so on.
Or what's the mood inside Britain? It's usually the pattern is that in the time of the crisis, the leadership, the government, the prime ministers, presidents, they get a boost because the country does unite. The society does. Is it the same pattern in Britain?
Yes, there's quite a lot of jingoism. Boris personally always was popular. He's got a populist personality, and he is popular. But I am essentially a supporter of Boris Johnson. My politics are closer to his than to, let's say, Jeremy Corbyn, for sure. And yet, I certainly am not alone in British people being very unhappy with Boris's performance. And you've had some very negative articles in the media which would naturally be centre-right, like the Sunday Times, the Daily Telegraph, which Boris himself worked for until a few weeks ago. There's quite a lot of criticism. It's not just coming from The Guardian. But when it comes to the general public, they rally around Boris. He's a celebrity. Even the fact I'm using his first name, many people in Britain would simply refer to him as Boris. Normally, this is reserved for pop stars like, you know, Beyonce or Rihanna or Madonna. Normally, politicians are not called by their first name. Most people refer to Boris as Boris. And it can be simultaneously. You can both think he's a good guy and he's a leader you want and he knows how to give a good speech, while at the same time being quite disturbed by the government performance. Not that I think Trump has been perfect, he has not, but Donald Trump has done some bold things that are very different than Britain. For example, he banned flights from China already in late January. He banned flights from the European Union on, I think it was March 13th. Britain has done nothing of the sort, and people are asking questions why. If Britain is right, and you don't need face masks, if Britain is right, and there's no need to ban or ask people to isolate who are flying in, then explain it. They have daily press conferences, and they don't really explain it. And also, I think Britain should be honest about the death toll, because if they put on the screen that we think, you know, 35,000 or 44,000 have died, it may affect the policy planning going ahead. You know, every day is difficult, and I fear that the lockdown will go on longer in Britain than other countries, doing more economic damage and so on.
There is a pretty good chance that he will still survive politically.
He won a parliamentary landslide in December, so it's only 3 or 4 months ago. He's in an absolute landslide. The Labour Party have a new leader, Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer's only been leader for a few weeks. He's finding his feet. Keir Starmer has to try and fight against the supporters of Jeremy Corbyn. Boris Johnson, you know, as you know, he caught coronavirus and he had to go to hospital for a few days, and he was in the ICU and out of touch for 3 days, and then he only went back to work, having recuperated for 2 weeks. He only went back to work on Monday. Now, today, Wednesday, he's had a baby, and he previously said he would take 2 weeks paternity leave. I don't know whether he'll do it. But what's interesting is in the time that he was in hospital, he appointed Dominic Raab as his kind of deputy. And there are 2 interesting points. First of all, Dominic Raab is certainly not the strongest candidate. That would be someone like Michael Gove. And I suspect that Boris chose Dominic Raab because he doesn't want a strong person who might, you know, threaten him later by showing he's doing a better job than Boris Johnson is doing, a little bit like US presidents often choose rather weak vice presidents because they don't want to be shown up too much. So he chose Dominic Raab. The second point of interest, as I'm sure you all know, is that Dominic Raab's father was born in Pilsen, and then he grew up in Karlovy Vary or Carlsbad or Karlovy Vary before escaping the Nazis in 1938 and going to, I think, Tangier, then Morocco and Portugal, and arriving in Britain in 1942. So Dominic Raab has a Czech or Czech Jewish father and grandparents, and that makes him, as far as I'm aware, the first acting Prime Minister of Britain to have a Czech parent.
How badly is the British economy going to be hit by this? And the second challenge that's awaiting Boris is to somehow disentangle from the EU by the end of the year, and that may have economic repercussions of its own. So could you elaborate on that?
I'm not an economist, but what I'm told is that before the coronavirus crisis, Britain had an 88% debt to GDP ratio, but this was stable. It's now going to go over 100%. In other words, it has, it owes more money than it makes or than it has. And that's going to approach something like Italy has, possibly, okay? Also, Britain made a decision. The new, another thing Boris did is he fires people very often. So he fired his Chancellor of the Exchequer, his finance minister, in the middle of February, not because he was bad, but because he doesn't want anyone who will threaten his power. He brought in a new young Chancellor, who's 38, who had never been a government minister before. And that Chancellor has promised to pay 80% of everyone's salary. As you know, Britain did eventually go into lockdown later than other European countries. And now in lockdown, the British government is paying 80% of people's salaries, which is obviously a very expensive thing to do. And every day the lockdown continues will affect it economically. As far as Brexit is concerned, what I understand is that if Britain, the transition period ends on December 31st. If Britain wants to extend it, which it can do for up to 2 years, according to the treaty where they left on January 31st, if Britain wants to extend it, it has to make a request by June 30th. And Britain has said they will not make the request. They just announced that. And Britain, it sounds like that some around Boris Johnson almost want a no-deal Brexit. They've almost decided upon that, or at least they're playing a game of chicken with the EU, and they think the EU is going to blink. But it's a very dangerous proposition for the UK, in my view. Look, I have always been opposed to Brexit. Now, I'm not a great admirer of the European Union institutions. It could be reformed greatly. But then I'm not a great admirer of the United Nations either, but I don't think Britain should just leave the United Nations. I think that it's better for Britain, better for Europe, and definitely better for the smaller countries like the Czech Republic, that Britain would stay in Europe and be a kind of big player in Europe, maybe balance things out a little bit against the Germans and the French and so on. Britain is going to crash out, that even if Brexit is beneficial to Britain in the longer term, it will not be in the initial term. I mean, first of all, Britain is betting on doing a big deal with Donald Trump. Donald Trump, like most leaders, puts his own country first. So I don't think Britain is going to do a great trade deal with America will do a great trade deal with Britain. Then, as you know, Britain decided to defy Donald Trump and ask for the 5G telephone network with Huawei, the Chinese company, despite security risks. And I think that that Boris Johnson is kind of sliming up to the Chinese. And indeed, on that first Cobra meeting, the meeting about the coronavirus that Boris decided not to go to, you know what he was doing at the time? He went to a Chinese New Year party with the Chinese ambassador. So the question is why? Why was he spending his time celebrating the Chinese New Year and boycotting his own emergency meeting at a time when there had already been a couple of people infected in Britain, and he was already being warned by his own advisors that this pandemic could be like the Spanish flu? So I am not that optimistic for the British economy. We won the war, and there's a kind of national myth that Britain won World War II by itself. Now, of course, Britain played a very important role, but Britain couldn't possibly have won World War II without, I think it's 3 million American troops on D-Day landings, or at least, I can't remember the figures, but a lot. And of course, without help also from Czech and Polish pilots and so on, and the Soviets, the Red Army, of course. So, but when the Queen gave a speech about coronavirus a couple of weeks ago, and she's going to do another one next week, she alluded again to World War II and Vera Lynn and all this kind of stuff. And there's a bit of a national myth that Britain won World War II all by itself, and Britain doesn't need help from anybody else. and it's a myth, and it's a very, very dangerous one from a British point of view. And when I grew up, I went to a very good high school, and then I went to a good university. You know, I studied international relations, politics, PPE at Oxford, and no one ever explored, and I studied World War II, no one ever explored the failings of Britain in the 1930s. Not just appeasement, but the lack of armament, a whole catalogue of bad decisions by Britain. And no one ever pointed this out to me during my studying it. I had to learn for myself later. And there's a, you know, I've had to learn, you know, I've spent time internationally. I see Britain from the outside as well as the inside. And I see a catalogue of mistakes. And to answer Tomáš's earlier point, the general public doesn't see this. The general public believes the national myths. That, you know, the general public that supported Brexit thinks Britain doesn't need anybody. And the truth is, already this month, Britain had to fly in a whole load of people from Romania on an emergency flight because they had no one to pick apples to supply supermarkets. So a few weeks after Brexit, Britain's already flying in people from Romania to pick fruit. So, you know, and Britain needs immigration. I think most countries need immigration up to a point. And I think Britain, I think it's a mistake.
And let me go back to the personality of Boris Johnson. So do you think that there can be some change of his personality after recovering from coronavirus?
Of course it's possible. You know, a friend of mine who is, he's Christian and he's believing Christian, he said that when Boris Johnson came out of hospital and made his remarks, he saw something in Boris Johnson's eyes, which he thinks is akin to an almost religious awakening, an almost like life-death experience. I'm not saying that Boris will become a believing Christian, but it's a kind of equivalent of finding a religion or something. And he says that he's seen it, and he swears to God that he notices this kind of life-changing glow in Boris Johnson's eyes. And I said, well, Boris is certainly relieved because, you know, it was touch and go, but I don't think leopards change their spots. As I said, I first met Boris when I was a teenager. I met him on a number of occasions. We worked at the same time at the Daily Telegraph. He's a friend, he's a close friend of my mother and my sister. He sees my mother often, in fact. And I'm doubtful that people really change their personalities. They might adjust. I mean, look at, you know, say Donald Trump. Has Donald Trump really changed his personality since you know, he became president? I don't think so. It's like, you know, it's like he may adjust. And also, to be fair, look, Boris is highly intelligent. Okay, he's almost a born leader. He was the president of the Oxford Union Debating Society, which is a very prestigious society. When I was at Oxford, he was almost, you know, he said already as a teenager, he famously said that he wanted to be world king, because at the time he was also an American citizen. It was, you know, it wasn't a question of where he would be leader. It was also talk he might be American president at that time. He later gave up his American citizenship to become British Prime Minister. But, you know, Boris has always been incredibly ambitious, but he's not ideological particularly. He has a kind of worldview, but he's not an ideologue. He's in a way a pragmatist, or what's good for him and so on. So I think that he's pragmatic, he can adjust, and that's a good thing. He's not so rigid, but he does have a reckless side to him. And the reason I mentioned his private life is because, as is well known, other lovers of him have had abortions from him. He's got at least one person, he has at least one other child who he pays child support for because there was a legal case and he had to give DNA and he has to pay child support, but he never sees that child, who's now a teenager. And the reason I mention this is he's not the first person to have lovers. Look at all those French presidents and so on, okay? And, you know, I'm not judging him about that. What I'm judging him by is his sheer recklessness. The fact is he keeps on getting people pregnant and so on. And he, for example, if I was him, I would have waited a few months. I would have got divorced first. Carrie Symonds, his girlfriend, just turned 32, so she's not, you know, there was no particular rush. They could have waited another year. Okay, he only been prime minister for a few months. He knew, if we do the math, she must have got pregnant about 2 weeks after he became prime minister. And it's all a bit much, okay? I mean, with a crying baby at home, it's hard to concentrate. Even without the coronavirus, he knew he was going to do Brexit. He knows it's a huge thing for Britain to do. And I think it's all a bit too much. And it's all a kind of like, we'll muddle through. Although, to be fair to Boris Johnson, David Cameron, who was also at Oxford with me, and I also know, he was also a bit reckless in the way he carried out the Brexit vote. It was the same kind of Oxford arrogance. Oh, everything will be just fine, it will all muddle through, you know, we'll just hold a vote for Brexit and we'll just, you know, everything will just be fine. And they hadn't really thought it through. Even the vote itself was not a well-formulated referendum. The question wasn't well-formulated. So I'm not saying that Britain is not a great country. It is a wonderful, wonderful country in many, many ways. But there is a sort of arrogance which I don't think is helpful. And just as, you know, I'm worried that Boris, he's not a details person. He's a kind of slightly rash person, you know, which is, you know, one moment this, one moment that. And I'm a bit, and also he's kind of purged from his cabinet or distanced the other really good, you know, the other experienced British politicians whose names you will remember because they're only around a few months ago. A few months ago, Jeremy Hunt was Foreign Secretary, the Foreign Minister. Philip Hammond was Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister. They're nowhere. He's got rid of all these people because they were political rivals or whatever, or he wanted to push Brexit through. So I think that, you know, he's got a team around him that's not that experienced. It's not only him. It's also the team around him. So I really hope I'm wrong. And I don't want to prejudge Boris too soon, and he may come out of this all well. But right now, as of today, I'm not that optimistic.
How much it is driven by the PR people, what he does, and how much it is his own?
I think he's a little bit like Donald Trump in the sense that Trump goes with his political instincts, and Trump doesn't necessarily follow opinion polls or what the experts are saying. Trump is his own person, and Trump had an enormous political success. He first of all brought down the Bush dynasty. He beat 16 other professional senators and governors and so on the Republican side. And then he beat the Clintons, you know, Hillary and advisor Bill, to a victory. So Trump goes with his instincts, and Boris Johnson is a little bit similar. He goes with his instincts, and maybe Boris Johnson's instincts are better than the experts. Just like, I'm not making a judgment on Trump's record, but I'm saying Trump, it was an outstanding political victory. For Trump to spot issues that resonated with people that were forgotten by the political class. In Trump's case, that would be immigration, you know, build the wall, or blue-collar, lower middle-class workers that were traditional Democrat. So Boris also spotted Brexit as an issue. Most of the elites in Britain, the Conservative, Liberals and Labour elites, were all against Brexit, including David Cameron, and also Theresa May voted against Brexit before she became Prime Minister. And so did, you know, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and John Major and every other previous Prime Minister. But in terms of populist instincts, Boris got it right. So I don't want to, you know, Boris's instincts going forward could also be good. In terms of opinion polls, he doesn't really have to worry because Britain now has the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which means there cannot be an election for the next 4 or 5 years. He's, you know, under the British system, it's winner takes all. So he gets about 40% of the vote, but he gets, I don't know exactly what it is, but maybe 60 or 65% of the members of parliament. So he doesn't have to worry about opinion polls right now. He's, and also, as I said, Jeremy Corbyn was a very unpopular leader of the Labour Party. There's only a new leader, there's only 1 month in, so he's too early in. And the third party, the Liberal Democratic Party, are also without a leader. The leader resigned and they're going to pick a new leader and so on. So he doesn't and he also purged, as I said, the opposition from within his own party. So right now, he doesn't have to worry too much about public opinion. But right now, as you pointed out, Tomáš, we're in the middle of a crisis. People rally around the leader. People don't want to oppose the government. But, you know, 3 months from now, when they have to publish the official figures, if the British, you know, figures are much higher than other European countries and the economy is doing really badly, then who knows what can happen.
The new Labour leader, how much is he a challenger, a potential challenger to Boris Johnson?
Jeremy Corbyn, if you asked what is your policy for the British election and the British public, I would answer Corbyn would say free Palestine. In other words, he cared more about actually not a two-state solution, but in destroying Israel, than he did about the British public and British issues. He was utterly obsessed to the point that it really, as I said, he surrounded himself either with Holocaust deniers and outright anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists. So the new leader of the Labour Party, the very first thing he did was to apologise to British Jews for the unbelievable anti-Semitism. This is coming from the extreme left. As you may know, the extreme left infiltrated the British Labour Party, which was a kind of social democratic party, and these are Stalinists. You know, they are kind of almost fascistic Stalinists. They also, you know, Corbyn admires Putin. He was once asked, Corbyn was once asked, which leader of recent decades do you most admire? And he said, Erich Honecker, the former East German communist leader. So the reason I'm mentioning Corbyn is the first thing that the new leader, Keir Starmer, has to do is he has to fight a battle with the Corbynites in the Labour Party, who control the National Committee of the Labour Party and a lot of the party infrastructure. And it won't be easy. This is like a battle between Social Democrats and Trotskyites. It will be a vicious battle. So far, Keir Starmer gave his backing, not 100%, but his general backing to Boris Johnson over the coronavirus, both because he doesn't want to challenge him in the middle of the pandemic, but also because he first has to secure his own strength within the Labour Party so that he doesn't get overthrown by the Corbyn supporters that would like to overthrow him straight away. So far, Keir Starmer, I would say, has done quite a good job. I say this as someone who's not a particular supporter of the Labour Party. And to be honest, if there was an election right now with Keir Starmer, I think he would have a chance against Boris Johnson. But as I mentioned, the Fixed Term Parliament Act means there won't be an election for some years. So there is no real opposition. It would have to go to a depression or some absolute national crisis where the Conservative MPs decided to bring down the government.
In the context of coronavirus, is there in Johnson government or anywhere more discussion about the role of China?
They are overwhelmed in crisis management. What I fear about China is because Britain, or at least the government, seems so determined to do a hardline Brexit, and because countries which Britain historically had close relations with, because they were part of the British Empire, like India, like Australia, like New Zealand, like Canada, from what I understand, none of those countries are in a hurry to do a quick trade deal with Britain. If Britain thought that Australia and India and so on are going to be lining up to do a great deal with Britain, they're mistaken. They will, of course, do a deal with Britain, but Britain is very dependent on finding new trading partners. So it can't possibly ignore China, of course, if they're going to give up a lot of its trade with the EU. I don't know if there's enough strategic thinking going on with what it means to allow China to invest too much in Britain. I'm sure the Chinese will be happy to invest. And I think it was on February 24th that Britain sent a lot of its protective gear to China, even though, as a kind of goodwill gesture, even though China could have got it from, say, Turkey and other countries. And one of the reasons all these healthcare workers died in Britain is Britain doesn't have enough equipment for itself until now. So I don't know what they're doing with China, but I look, on a broader scale, I fear that this is the moment in history that China is emerging as the most important country in the world. And, you know, I'm not sure that Donald Trump or the Trump, you know, I think Trump would like to stop it. I don't know how powerful he is. And the Democratic Party in America is very close to China. If you look at people like Senator Dianne Feinstein, she's done all kinds of business deals and other with China. Joe Biden's son did amazing dealings with China. Madeleine Albright has made apparently $100 million for her consultancy to China. There are a lot of Democratic, Bloomberg, Michael Bloomberg also does all kinds of stuff with China. I'm told that MSNBC television, the parent company that owns NBC and MSNBC, is got heavily invested by China, and therefore they're reluctant to criticize China on NBC News and MSNBC. That's what I'm told. So who knows? I fear this is a pivotal moment in world history, but we'll see. Chinese government, the dictatorship there, of course, they should have told the world that they knew it was a human-to-human transmission. They deliberately lied that it was a human-to-human transition. They imprisoned or even apparently killed some of the doctors and so on who were saying it was. Until now, some of them have gone missing. And as I say, the West has done very little. You know, when Donald Trump ordered a flight ban from China at the end of January, he was, you know, Senator Biden was outraged. The New York Times ran an editorial calling Trump a xenophobe and a racist and encouraging people to go to China in early February. They say, ignore Trump's racism, go to China, okay? That's the New York Times editorial. As I mentioned, Boris Johnson chose to go to a Chinese New Year's party instead of his own government meeting. So, you know, also I believe in Central Europe, and I don't know exactly, but, you know, with I think Zeman in the Czech Republic possibly, and Orban in Hungary and so on, there have been some dealings with China, and one can't ignore China. But we'll see. Look, Trump, I think Donald Trump, if I was him, just like he won the last election on a kind of anti-Mexican, anti-immigrant catchphrase saying build a wall and so on, even though he was never going to build a wall, I think he'll run this election on an anti-Chinese catchphrase. I think that would be a populist thing of him to do. If I was as a political advisor to win the election, I would recommend he runs the election against China, and he may well do that. So look, Trump has spoken about things like not paying back American debt to China and so on. The Americans may still take on China, but, you know, who knows? They're so powerful, China. Will the European Union join with the Americans on this? I doubt it. You know, so even if America takes on China, are they even powerful enough? Will other countries side with America rather than siding with China? They may say the future's with China.
What's your explanation about Boris Johnson and his position on Huawei and 5G?
Obviously, I can only speculate, so I don't know, but I suspect that I would say these few points in no particular order. First of all, 5G is revolutionary. China already has a system. If he waits for the system that America is developing, or I believe Israel and America together developing a system, there'll be a delay in getting 5G in Britain. So having 5G quicker gives Britain some kind of advantage. That's one thing. He may also think it's cheaper, the system from China. But what I fear and this is maybe the main reason, is he thinks he's already got Donald Trump in the bag. He thinks they'll get a trade deal come what may with the United States, and he wants to establish strategic relations with China. And he's more worried about annoying the Chinese than he is about annoying Donald Trump. I fear that might be part of the reason.
I wanted to ask about Boris's relationship with Nicola Sturgeon and how the whole Scottish referendum, if we can expect referendum in a few years.
As you know, the other big victor of the general election in December was the Scottish National Party. They won an overwhelming majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament. And as their name suggests, they are a nationalistic party that wants an independent Scotland. The question is of timing, okay? If a hard Brexit goes ahead, and even more so if the European Union suggests to Scotland that an independent Scotland could pretty well rejoin the EU straight away without any trouble, I think that Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish leader, will call a referendum and she may win it. The only question is that according to British law, she has to get permission from Westminster, from the Parliament in London. So you could have a situation like you had in Catalonia 2 years ago, where the Catalan government decided to hold an independence referendum, but the government of Madrid said it's an illegal referendum and they sent troops, and now we have some of the Catalan political leaders in prison and so on, and a kind of standoff between the Catalan nationalists and the government in Madrid. And in fact, because of that, the EU may also be a little bit reluctant. A country like Spain may veto Scottish independence precisely because it doesn't want the Catalans to have independence, or the French don't want the Corsicans or Sardinians or their various other possible independent movements, you know, in Europe. So, but unlike the Catalans, the Scots are a pretty tough lot. I would not think it wise. If they decide to hold a referendum, I do not think it wise of the British government to send the army or police to try and stop people voting. It will lead to some kind of serious violence, and the Scots are pretty tough. So who knows? I think it's very much in the hands of Nicola Sturgeon. One of the first things Boris Johnson announced when he became, after his election victory in December, was he wanted to build a bridge between Northern Ireland and Scotland, which is preposterous, because first of all, it will be an incredibly expensive thing to do. And secondly, no one asked for it, not the Scots, not the Northern Irish. There's no demand for a bridge, their boats, their planes. It would be a ridiculous thing to do, and an incredibly expensive thing to do. So why did he do that? I think he's trying to make a political point that Scotland and indeed Northern Ireland should stay part of Britain. But it's not just Scotland that might leave. Northern Ireland is very interesting to watch, because in the past, the Protestants who wanted to stay in Britain were a majority. But slowly, there are less Protestants and more Catholics. And we're soon at a point where the Catholics may outnumber the Protestants. And in the past, the opposition of Protestants in Northern Ireland to join the Republic of Ireland was partly a religious one. In the past, the Republic of Ireland was the most Catholic country in Europe, even more than Poland. When I was younger, I remember that not only was divorce illegal, but abortion was illegal. And I remember a case of a 14-year-old Irish girl who had been raped by her father and was carrying her father's baby. She came, a group in England helped her to come to England so she could have an abortion from her father's baby when she was 14. And when she returned to Ireland, they arrested her, okay? Because it's illegal to have an abortion. So this kind of thing made people in Northern Ireland not want to join Southern Ireland. Fast forward to today. The Republic of Ireland, I've never seen such a revolution in social attitudes. The Republic of Ireland has an openly gay, half-Indian Prime Minister. It was one of the first countries in the world to legalize gay marriage. And remember, only a few years earlier, it was punishable by I think even prison to be homosexual in Northern Ireland. So today, and also the Irish economy it's had ups and downs, but on the whole, it's done very well in the last, 10 or 20 years. So today, a Northern Irish Protestant, who's probably less religious than they were 20 years ago, because everyone's less religious in Ireland, and also staying inside the European Union, the Republic of Ireland, it may not be such a bad thing. And I think if there was a referendum in Northern Ireland, the Northern Irish may also decide to reunite with the Southern Irish. And of course, the Southern Irish would offer the Protestants in Northern Ireland some kind of localized parliament and some kind of special rights and so on. So we could see if Brexit doesn't work. Okay, Boris Johnson has to make Brexit work. If it doesn't work, you could see unstoppable campaigns in both Scotland and Northern Ireland to leave Britain and rejoin the European Union. Northern Ireland as part of the Republic of Ireland, Scotland as a separate state. Another point about Brexit, whatever people say, a lot of people voted Brexit because of migration, okay? A kind of xenophobia, or maybe a feeling that too many people arrived in Britain, and I understand that feeling. There was an incredible influx of millions of people in the last 10 or 20 years in Britain. So if you're working class English person in a town in Northern England, and suddenly your child is a minority of English speakers in your school, and in fact there are schools where I think 80% of the kids, one of them speaks Slovak or something in Scotland or somewhere. I understand. They feel they're losing their country, and they voted Brexit on a kind of impulse to try and stem the tide of migration. The problem is that, for them, is that migration isn't going to stop. But there's somehow a kind of myth of a totally white Christian Britain from the 1950s. It's impossible to go back to that. And what I fear is if Brexit fails, then there'll be a kind of far-right resurgent resentment. The people that did support the Brexit Party, which is a lot of people, 1 year ago in the European elections, they won something like 1 in 3 votes, the Brexit Party. That's more than any other party. They won more than the Conservative Party. Those people, 1 out of 3 people that voted for the Brexit Party, and many of them are Labour supporters, they're working class Labour supporters. What I fear is some nationalistic, maybe racist party, like the AfD in Germany or something. Some populist leader will say the Conservatives betrayed us, they didn't do a real Brexit, there's still all these foreigners living here, and the economy is doing really badly, and the unemployment's high, and where are the promised jobs, and where are the promised benefits on Brexit? I fear a possible kind of far-right movement, in which case I'm thankful that Boris Johnson is Prime Minister, because he's suitably skillful and he's suitably populist and he's got a television appeal. If anyone can slap down a far-right party, it would be him, because he's good at that kind of, and by the way, I don't think Boris, although he supported Brexit, he is not in any way a racist or xenophobic. I know him, he's quite the opposite. And as you may know, he himself is a kind of mixture. One of his grandparents is from Turkey. Another of his grandparents is a American-born Jew from Lithuanian origin, and so on. So Boris Johnson himself is a bit of a mishmash. Brexit is a huge gamble. And, if the people behind Brexit had produced a kind of blueprint, a referendum, a plan, if they were united behind a plan, then I could say, well, they fought it out and maybe it will work. But there are huge divisions, even among the Brexiteers, between those people that want a closer relation with Europe, those people that want to turn their backs on Europe. There are all kinds of different motivations behind Brexit. And to put this again in context, although we're talking about Britain, Britain remains a very, very important country. It is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. It has one of the most important armies in the world. It is one of only a very few countries with its own nuclear weapons and nuclear arsenal. It, in spite of what I'm criticizing the government now, is still, quote unquote, the mother of democracies. And So it's an important role on the international stage. It's important for the world that Britain is successful. And it's very important, I think, for all of Europe, and especially for the smaller countries in Europe, like the Czech Republic. Because, you know, Europe without Britain is a weaker Europe. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Chinese and Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump were all for Brexit. You know, it suits them. Europe is weaker without Britain. You've divided, you've taken out the second most important country. I would say Britain's more important than France. So in some ways, anyway, it's more important than France. So the second most economically important. In terms of the military, it's one of the two with France and so on. And of course, there'll still be cooperation. But if Britain really crashes out, there'll be less cooperation than there should have been.